when the campaign started, Brexit looked a bit like a few nasties, a few weirdos. Without the working class vote, it would never have happened. It was decisive, and this was the moment that they could say, and the thing I kept on hearing was, if we don't do this, you, they said, pointing at me, will never listen to another word we say. Right, so it was a real reclamation of some form of democratic accountability, a restoration of a democracy where people were allowed to make their mistakes.
Hello and welcome to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of life in the early 21st century. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Maurice Glasman. Maurice is a Labour life peer in the House of Lords. He is Baron Glasman of Stoke Newington and of Stamford Hill. He is a political theorist, an academic, and a widely published commentator on political affairs. He is deeply involved in thinking about and talking about the nature of the Labour Party and the future of the Labour Party. He was a policy advisor to Ed Miliband when Miliband was Labour leader. And Maurice coined the term Blue Labour to describe a small c conservative form of socialism, one which would emphasise a return to community values based around trade unions, the church, voluntary groups, and so on. Maurice has been critical of both New Labour and Old Labour, and he is, in my view, one of the most articulate critics of the European Union project. He is the author of Unnecessary Suffering, Managing Market Utopia, and he has described himself, intriguingly, as a radical traditionalist. Maurice, welcome to the show.
Really, thank you for inviting me.
I guess I have to kick off by asking you, I gave a little brief description there, but if you could just tell us what you mean and what you understand by Blue Labour. There are so many coloured political creeds floating around at the moment. Red Toryism, blue collar conservatism led by Esther McVey and various others. And then the one that stands out and the one which I think is enjoying a lot of commentary and popularity is Blue Labour. So what does it mean to you?
Well, so I'm not a Tory and I'm not really red. So that helped me. I was trying to articulate my own views and what capitalism essentially does in splitting families up, moving people away from the people that they love and the places that they were born, about giving a primacy to just individual self-interest. I was very innocent with it. And I was working with London Citizens Community Organising on living wage and an anti-usury campaign in 2008. When the crash came, the banks were borrowing at 0.5% and poor people were borrowing at 5,000%, just to give you some idea of what drives me completely nuts. And what I found in London Citizens, working with Black Church, Muslim, overwhelmingly Catholic communities, was a similarity to my mum's views. My mum was working class Labour who didn't question that family was really important work. There was from a Jewish background, so a cosmic debt to Britain about fighting fascism, that only the Jews in Britain actually lived. A certain modesty of approach, a suspicion of career, all these things. But when I began to talk to my own class, the class that I emerged into, educated, graduate, middle class, about these matters, about families, stability, patriotism, I was told that these were Tory values, right, that they weren't socialist or Labour values. But the more I looked into Labour history, the more they were completely fundamental. The founding acts, I know you said and so on in the beginning, but the formation of burial societies so that working class people could have a dignified burial was in fact the first act of the Labour movement through the cooperatives.
Right.
Because previously to that, after enclosures, working class people had a pauper's grave, mass graves. And then the formation of the building societies, where somehow a home was retrieved in the world, and the importance of a home and a settlement and community you share with others. So I became sort of belligerent about it and said, no, these are fundamental. What your values are liberal values. And it was precisely the Labour movement that didn't join the Liberal Party, which it could have done. And its genius was to combine a sense of security, stability, and mutuality, which was a huge movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, where people pooled their resources to improve their lives. So they kept on saying, these are just Tory values, these are conservative values. So I said, sod it, I'll just call it Blue Labour then. And also the blue was due to another thing, that very important thing, which is that in progressive thought, what's the least true thing you've ever heard in politics? The line, things can only get better. But there is in progressive thought an optimistic teleology, the idea that things will improve, things can only get better. And what I saw was that people who experience, blue sadness, difficulty, were often, and particularly children, were often being diagnosed as depressed and put on drugs, legal drugs. So I've seen in my life the move from illegal to legal drugs. I see the difference between the 70s and now is that now people go to the doctor and get prescribed, while then I witness people doing other things. So this idea of living with sadness, of that not being a pathology, that being the tragic, being part of life, that was also blue. And that kind of expressed how I felt about New Labour, that this was a superficial tragedy, that was a deep tragedy, that when the crash came, they had nothing. They had no political economy. It was the state, they'd put everything on an administrative state. So those combination of things, and understanding that life is difficult, sad, that the things that really matter in life are relational things, loving things, and being able to start to talk about things like being a good friend or faithful. This was all very hostile to the prevailing environment. So Blue Labour kind of summarised, and to top it off, politics is not a rational activity. It can be reasonable, but it's not rational. Loads of political matter is involved. Contradictions, people think they're contradictions. So we were very paradoxical in thinking. That's when we coined phrases like radical traditionalists, things like that.
Yeah.
And so Blue Labour was also an expression that in politics you can have different pulls on your heart. You can be simultaneously really radical and quite conservative in disposition. And that's always what a successful politics is a combination of quite profound things that people will rationally say, well, they're contradictory, but we would say that they're mutually supportive. So we would say that being patriotic and internationalist are mutually supportive. And we would say that being really radical economically and quite conservative socially are mutually supportive. But from a rationalist perspective, they look contradictory. So we thought we'd put out Blue Labour. Right.
That's a very good outline of Blue Labour. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was when you think those values, which I agree with you are not Tory values, and I always find it very surprising when these kind of almost year zero pseudo-radical leftists of today will look upon those things and sniff at them as kind of Tory values and outdated values and unfashionable and maybe even borderline fascistic, if you're interested in the family and the community, and
certainly reactionary.
So I agree with you that those values have a long tradition in Labour heartlands and working class areas.
Well, in working class life.
Life,
the concept of being decent is someone who doesn't piss all their money away drinking, but takes it home. These are things of fundamental importance. We put, every year we write, be nice to your mum. This is what people actually respect in a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you when you think that kind of stuff started to get lost in relation to the Labour Party. So the easy answer, and I think an answer a lot of people would come up with, is New Labour. I mean, like you, I am a stinging critic of the New Labour era, but I think you trace it back to 1945 and the problems raised by the growth of welfarism in relation to working class communities.
That's part of the story, but I do want to give credit to Attlee that people like Ernest Bevin, Herbert Morrison were really significant political figures, people who emerged from both the trade unions and from municipal socialism. In many ways, he held the ring. The key thing in 45 was that Labour moved away from its position in the 20s and the 30s about worker-run or co-run industries. The Labour position was actually quite federal and decentralist, was that there should be the active participation of the workforce in the governance of their industries. And the railways were very strong on this. Really interesting plans for the canals, that they should be controlled by local community trusts. There were waves of this, the national trust. So what happened in 45 is Labour went Fabian, and in some ways a bit Soviet, in the sense of a centrally planned, nationalised economy. So 45 held attention, but let's say the coalition between Hampstead and Hull was still operative and strong. And they passed a lot of very pro-working class. It's just that the managers of the new industries were not workers; they were PPE graduates. That's where the worm started. But it was really in the 60s when the socialist political economy started to fail, when the whole concept of nationalised, state-run, managerially planned economies was starting to be besieged, is that Labour then became quite liberal in its social policy, and that links up that the state, because the state couldn't do the economy, therefore the state had to essentially take over the social. So the idea of the active participation of working class organisations in their own lives, self-government. So this nationalisation of things did lead to essentially the elimination of the forms of the labour movement, which, don't forget, had schools, nurseries, they ran allotments, they ran a huge number of aspects, but all of those in the name of justice was taken over by the state. So that essentially when Thatcher came and Labour virtually completely caved in terms of political economy and the superiority of markets, all it had left was the progressive liberal agenda through the state. So that's a rough summary of how I see. So it's been a long post-war, but all of it leads to the essential impotence, marginalisation and disintegration of those institutions that were built by workers for workers.
That's what I was going to come on to. If you could just talk a bit about the consequences or the impact that these developments have on working class communities and their institutions. So if you go from 45 and the growth of the kind of Fabian approach, and then through to the 60s and 70s and the problems that are experienced by nationalised industry, and then through to Thatcher/New Labour and this idea that there is no alternative, the market is all there is. All of those developments in the post-war period, what do they do to working class institutions, and what impact do they have on working class people?
Well, it's a decimation, and it should be looked at, I think, in that way. And one of the only ways of understanding the present is to understand the powerlessness, the marginalisation, then the demonisation. So first of all, let's just begin with the political economy aspects. So they were told that the work that they did was no longer of any use to the country. So that's miners, that's shipbuilders, that this was no longer of really any consequence, and that manual labour, in fact, or skilled labour, was a thing of the past. This reached its consummation with New Labour's educational policy, which was all about transferable skills and the knowledge economy. So the idea that we all had to go to university. So what you had was the opening up of higher education, of universities, often with terrible problems for universities in maintaining standards, credibility, and those things. The closing down of the industries around which a huge number of communities lived, and then the denigration of how they lived, and then the state nationalisation of the institutions. The only ones that are left really are the working men's clubs and the miners' clubs that still function in some ways in those places. But you don't need to go very far to travel around the northeast and the northwest. And now assembly halls and miners' clubs are fashionable flats in university towns. They built public spaces, they built debate spaces, educational institutions. And then they were told, so vocational training, apprenticeships are completely decimated. If you look at the graph about investment in university education and investment in vocations, in the kind of early 70s, there's a rough parity. And then it's huge. Right. I mean, there is a disintegration. And then they're told, but we do need our toilets fixed, and we do need to build houses, and we do need skilled workers. And so import immigrants. So they were told that their skills were useless. And then they were told that they had to accept immigration because they were useless and they couldn't do the work. And what happened is, obviously, the Labour is becoming increasingly middle class and buying into use that word again, a teleology, a notion of an end state where there is no working class. So they're kind of bought into an idea that these things no longer matter. And then they're being priced out of the market by essentially one thing communism was very good at. One of the very few things it was good at was maintaining its vocational training.
Right.
They kept it from pre-war. I mean, in Poland, Bulgaria, I've looked into this. They kept essentially pre-war training.
Right.
So what you had was incredibly skilled bricklayers, electricians, plumbers coming in. And essentially for 20 to 30 years, there'd been no investment in those communities at all. And if there was, it was about going to university. It wasn't about those skills and those trades. So left without representation, without institutions, without a place in the society. And then, and completely understandably, people are, and me too, will always be sympathetic to poor immigrants who come and the necessity of welcoming them and building relationships with them. So essentially they almost disappear from politics, but also disappear from Labour's concerns, that they're racist, that they're backward, that, if they're looked at at all, I would say it would be reminiscent of how Native Americans were looked at on reservations. Well, there's family problems, there's the alcohol, if you look at the opiate stuff, all through old mining villages and surrounding areas. And then came the shock of it all, which is that they actually exist and they actually win elections. Yeah. And that's the scandal of Brexit, is that the losers won.
Yeah. I want to come on to Brexit because it's the happy, not the ending, but it's the happy moment in this story, I think, which is the return of those people who've been decimated for so long, saying we're still here. But I've got some specific questions to ask you on that. But first thing I wanted to
the point I was making, just to say, is that was the shock of Brexit for lots of people, is that they really thought that they've got phrases, progressives, the arc of history. Yeah. And the right side of history. Yeah, they're quite Whiggish in this way. So this was inexplicable. How could this be? Yeah. And that's how I view that, as fundamentally to do with class and an affirmation of a certain inheritance, which says, I trust Parliament more than the ECJ. It goes quite deep.
Oh yeah, always good to break that so-called arc of history. This always surprises the right people who need to be surprised. Just on that, I think, very accurate description you gave of the attack, really, on working class institutions and working class communities, I wanted to just talk about, there is economic decimation, the denigration of the work that they did and the removal of the work that they did. There's community denigration in the sense of, capitalists and others abandoning these communities when they're no longer useful, with all the terrible consequences that can have. And then there's also cultural denigration and demonization, as you refer to it. So one of the interesting things, I think, is that Labour shifts towards the kind of progressive liberalism is really all that it has going for it. In the 1980s, I think, is quite an important moment for that. If you look at Labour councils, for example, especially in London, that's really when they start to embrace identity politics and ideas of racial equality and gay equality and other ideas which are incredibly important ideas, but they become something quite different, something quite identitarian, something quite divisive, and so on. And it's really through that process, and this continues through to today, that we also see the denigration of working class culture and of working class values, and this idea that, we liberals who tend to live in London or in the city are more enlightened than you, we're more switched on, we're more politically correct, we have all the right views, and you guys are backward and stupid. So it's such a comprehensive assault at so many different levels. And do you think any of those attacks is the decisive one in terms of communicating to working class people that they are no longer valued by society? Or do you think it's a kind of an effect that builds up over time?
Well, it's certainly a cumulative attack. and I'm with you. So that's also linked to the denigration of, or the complication relating to the Second World War. So a huge thing is that working class people fought and supported the war, and they got an enormous reward in 1945. There was a recognition of how they'd been treated before by many middle class people. So, and that led to a genuine kind of left patriotism.
Yeah.
That was in many ways embodied in that Attlee-Bevin combination. So what was the working class role? It wasn't seen as that the working class in Britain, and got to talk about the English working class too, or the only working class in Europe that didn't go fascist, didn't go communist,
right?
Stayed straight with Labour, stayed straight with Parliament. This was an astonishing resolve, but you look back then to what happened after Chartism with the formation of Labour, and you see that it understood and valued the inheritance of liberty, of free speech. Working class promoted religious toleration way early, but it wasn't done in liberal terms. It was done through freedom of association. You know, that people were allowed. So people forget, and it's nuts when you talk about it now. But in 1889, you know, the dock strike. The thing that shocked middle class opinion was the sight of Cardinal Manning and the Salvation Army, William Booth, of Catholic and Protestant working together. The scandal of the cooperative burials was that Catholics and Protestants buried each other. There was a very split working class, but the Labour movement accommodated the Catholic conservatism and, if you like, the Protestant conservatism within itself, within the frame of a quite radical Labour movement that understood that class and the economy would have to be dealt with. So much of that working class culture is still alive. So, for example, we did research. What is the most valued characteristic among people? If you ask them, is the people who buy their round? Is there still the notion of mutuality? Absolutely. And people who don't are free riders? So this idea of mutual contribution, of all that they'd done to retrieve some dignity from humiliating experience, foundational experience, which was that mixture of enclosures and industrialization, which left them as paupers in the new towns. So essentially, culturally, all that they'd built, and there was a lot in that about bravery and stoicism, and it was very contrary to the expressive self-love of emerging liberal culture. So they were seen as also emotionally inadequate.
Yeah.
So the whole contribution of the working class to post-war music, which was an extraordinarily rich thing of writing, all of this was for nothing, you know, as of nothing, and has very little representation. So to answer your question, it was an assault on a class, and it was economic, it was political, and it was cultural, and it was happening simultaneously and quite intensely on all fronts. And that was part of the new left. Which was going to be a very different, you know, not so much liberty as a sort of relativism. So working class used to understand liberty as being able to express contrary views safely, and being able to practice your religion without threat. But there were much more mixed views about what was going on sexually in terms of drugs. There were reservations about those things that were automatically seen as reactionary. So when I say culture, I'm not just talking about arts, and it was an assault on a certain stable, modest life that was no longer seen as worthwhile. Yeah,
absolutely. I completely agree with you about buying rounds. Where I come from, the biggest insult you can make against someone is that they don't get their round in. It's seen as the death knell of their reputation.
So these things don't die. What I'm saying is they still knock around.
Absolutely. I agree with your outline there that you've just put. And it struck me, there was a film a few years ago about the gay rights activists who went to a mining community in the 1980s, as a true story, to assist with the miners' strike. And the film captured the culture clash between the two groups, but obviously it did so because it was made these days, it did so with much more of the positive emphasis on the gay identitarian groups who went to these mining communities who basically opened their eyes to the right way to live and how to dress in a zany way and to shake off their kind of staid, square, homely culture, which I thought was actually quite an apt description of some of the political views that now do pass for allegedly progressive left-wing attitudes. You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. If you like this podcast and Spike's other podcasts, and also the articles and essays that Spiked publishes every day, please think about giving us a donation. Spike's content is free and we want to keep it free, and donations really help us to do that. Head over to Spike's donation page now at www.spiked-online.com. But I want to bring it forward before we get to Brexit, which is
Take your time.
a great crescendo. I want to bring it to Corbynism. So we've gone through a kind of potted history of what's happened to Labour and what's happened to working class communities. And then we have Corbynism, which is not as straightforward as people might assume. So to some people, it looks like an attempt to recover old Labour values. To others, it looks like a kind of neo-Marxist, zealous movement of young radicals. And then you, I think, have said something very interesting about Corbynism, which is that it actually is reminiscent in some ways of New Labour, which Corbynistas would be horrified by, but in the sense that it still is, it's a Labour movement, so to speak, which adheres to a globalist view or an ideal of a cosmopolitan global order, which emphasizes freedom of movement over, I don't know, working class wages or whatever it might be. So that would strike a lot of people, not least Corbyn supporters, as a controversial statement.
Yeah, it's just to bring to public discussion the idea that many of the assumptions of Corbyn and New Labour as regards the theoretical structures of liberalism, of globalization, are very similar, but it's taken a while for that to really come to fruition. Mm-hmm. So there was another bit of Corbynism that was Bennite.
Yeah.
That was Eurosceptic, that had a genuine connection and respect for working class culture and institutions. So it's taken a while to look at the class basis of Corbynism. And the class basis of Corbynism has turned out to be overwhelmingly middle class, identity based, but that wasn't as clear initially. I genuinely thought that there was a possibility for Labour to lead a democratic Brexit. Actually, that Corbyn was the only conceivable figure who could do that, and perhaps deep in his soul he sits there sorrowful. But he quite correctly analysed that the class relations in the party weren't going to permit him to follow that path. So, one working class man said to me at a meeting in Bolton, he said, Blair, Corbyn, two cheeks of the same arse. That's what he actually, and I asked him what he was talking about. Is where there's no place for us in any of this.
Right.
And that's one way of putting it.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people feel exactly like that. Right, so on to Brexit. We've talked about the post-war assault on the people who make up the backbone of this country, and they are forgotten, or people think they've disappeared, or people think they're all at university doing these new ridiculous courses, but actually they're still there. They're still working. They're still in their communities. Brexit obviously expressed many different communities' aspirations, but to what extent do you think the working class is saying, guys, we're still here, we still have agency, and we're going to assert our presence? Do you think that was a decisive factor in Brexit?
If you look at it, when the campaign started, Brexit looked a bit like the William Hague coalition. A few nasties, a few weirdos, stranded shires. And its polling was like that. It was actually when the referendum started that working class people started to look at this as a genuine way of restoring some form of democratic representation. So I was involved in Labour Leave and trade unions against the EU. I had a relationship with the Leave campaign. So I was travelling about. And what you saw was from Newcastle right down to Dover, which is the country I moved to, you could feel it moving. So without the working class vote, it would never have happened. It was decisive. And this was the moment that they could say, and the thing I kept on hearing was, if we don't do this, they said, pointing at me, will never listen to another word we say. Right. So it was a real reclamation of some form of democratic accountability was going on, a restoration of a democracy where people were allowed to make their mistakes. So the working class vote was decisive, and it remains decisive. This is what they can't shift. This is the root of the mayhem. It's obvious that the ruling class are completely committed to remain. Yeah. And yet they can't shift this very, very strong commitment that people have to the vote that they made. Yeah. And now they realise that they're really doubting whether democracy works. Yeah. Or, but that's the covenantal promise of democracy that the working class always cleave to, that their conditions could be changed, not through violence, but through voting and organisation and building their institutions. And that's why this is really serious politics now.
So do you see Brexit as being in keeping with a very long tradition in this country? In fact, I mean, you talked about the Chartists, you go through to the suffragettes, of course, or you could go back to Peterloo, the 200th anniversary of which was very recent. You have these great moments, defining moments in the history of this country, particularly England, but the UK more broadly, in which working class communities played a key role in demanding democratic clout and in protecting democratic accountability, because they see it correctly as the only means through which their communities can affect change and improve their lives. Whereas I think one of the things that the kind of middle class Remainers and Ramonas and others don't understand is that just because they have access to various institutions and platforms and mechanisms through which to influence policy, that doesn't mean other people do as well. So there's a very interesting divide on there. Who has power and where do they have it? But do you see Brexit as being in keeping with those traditions and of working class democracy?
Well, in every way. That's the point. In every way, including the point from the previous question, is that the working class contribution was decisive. In all of these things, there's always a smattering of campaigning groups and moral action groups, but the winning of working class support for things was decisive in all of that. And then the extension of the vote was a really sustained thing, and patience and religious toleration. So people are mistaken in thinking that people voted in the referendum and the working class thought that the ruling class would keel over. They didn't. And so there's a resolution. I mean, there's a historic memory in that. And, we talked earlier about the economic things and the political things and the cultural things, but, above all, I think it was theoretical and philosophical that these people did not matter. Yeah. That globalization was going a certain way, that liberalism was going a certain way, that technology demanded a borderless world, and they're also asserting something about the nation state and the importance of a national political community and the sovereign nature of the decisions that can be corrected, that can, through other votes. So this Brexit is far more interesting than we're looking. Yeah. So we get tied up in all these very short-term hoo-has and language, but in fact Brexit is genuinely important because it says, where does power lie? Yeah. And who holds it? And this notion in English history in particular that you can get rid of your rulers. Yeah. Turns out to be a lot, can I vote them out? That's why I kept on being asked in the referendum campaign, can I vote them out? Yeah. Well, no. And that was sort of the end of okay, well, let's stick with the system we got then. Yeah.
I feel the same way. And sometimes I think I've put my finger on the magnitude of Brexit, and then I realise it's even larger than I had thought. I mean, I think it really does crystallized so many historic questions. In many ways, it's like, the ruling classes thought they had put a lid on all those unresolved questions of English history about who rules, where does power lie, who is sovereign or what is sovereign.
Who owns the land, all those things. And then along comes Brexit and blows that lid off and everything flies out. And what you have now is a ruling class desperately trying to put the lid back on. But one thing I wanted to ask you about the vote for Brexit, and particularly the working class vote for Brexit, which was decisive, as you say, to what extent can it be seen as, and this brings us on back to Blue Labour and those ideas, to what extent do you think the vote for Brexit is an expression of a desire for social solidarity, for something outside of yourself? Because one of the things that strikes me is that really, there are many ideologies swirling around in this country, but two of the key ones of recent times, which is the kind of, Thatcherite New Labour market worship approach. And then there's the kind of progressive liberalism / Corbynista pushback against that. Both of those actually share something important in common, which is they have a very individuating dynamic and a very atomizing dynamic where you can only be understood really as an individual. And therefore, things like family and community, far less the nation state, don't particularly matter that much. Do you see Brexit as in some ways an attempt to restore democracy and respect for working class communities, but also to recover something beyond the self, which can connect us to each other? Yeah, I would say so. Just to look at that, if you look at what links Thatcherism or New Labour with the sort of, I sometimes call it sort of nomadic progressivism, just because the idea is of the individual freed from all constraints.
Yeah.
The ultimately unconstrained self, without any thought about, Roman emperors and what they were like when they were freed from all constraints. And so there's a whole load of stuff there that we can, or we could talk about, but probably won't, about sin, and about doing harm to others if you put yourself first. But fundamental, what links them is individualism and globalization. So there is a twin thing. The first is Thatcher had a view of the global market, that you had to be competitive in this global market. And I would say that the underpinning sort of Remain left progressivism is a borderless world where, everybody gets to know everybody and is everybody and no one and themselves. But what's all neglected in this is how do you look after children? How do you look after old people? A home. What does it mean to have a home in the world? And if you look at the four factors of globalization, which is, when I say capitalism, just everybody, I mean a system that tries to turn human beings and nature into a commodity, and a commodity is something with a fluctuating price on a market. So it's an insane thing that actually tries to commodify creation itself.
Yeah.
So that's a relentless power, and then you've got this idea of an administrative state which upholds a form of procedural justice, which is embedded within an international treaty-based system that's based on the primacy of liberalism. That's property rights, human rights. And those ideas bound within technological teleology that it doesn't matter because you can't control technology. So all of this moves away from any stability of settlement, any stability of life. So you have the churn of populations, you have the churn of capital, you have the same procedures, so a lack of any distinctive local institutions, any mediation between, and then you realize, oh my God, what you're dealing with is the concentration of capital increasingly, which we can see in building societies and banks, and all forms are increasingly centralized, and the centralized state is that in fact the individual has no power. That you just have to adjust. You just have to fit in. And then you've got these aching sense of loss as your mum's 300 miles away in a care home and you think she's being neglected, but you can't get home and you can barely pay your rent. So just to say this is a very long way, and I apologize for I just wanted to add globalization to the individualism.
Yeah.
That as a teleology of the direction of life that's almost technologically driven, and that undermines the very fundamental meaning of people's lives.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How can I be good?
Yeah.
How can I honor my obligations to those that I love?
Yeah.
And these things become, and then that's the nature of the impotence and the rage, and the tragedy of it all is that Labour was precisely that institution that offered representation within a quite conservative framework of institution building and parliamentary reform.
I think that it's a really important point about the impact of so-called individualism on the individual, because I think that's one of the frustrating things about the cult of the individual of recent times, which is that it actually doesn't bolster individual autonomy or individual freedom, but it can have the opposite effect, because the unrestraining of the individual from any sense of responsibility or connection can actually lead to a great deal of confusion. And, if you look at the politics...
And emptiness.
And emptiness. And if you look at the politics of identity, what that creates are individuals who are utterly reliant on validation from external powers, be it the state validating their identity or the community respecting every gender choice that they make. And if you don't, they will have a nervous breakdown. So it actually creates this kind of psychic dependence on authority. So I think that's one of the ironies of this kind of worship of the individual, whether it comes from the market forces or the kind of new so-called progressive left, is that it actually ends up crushing the individual
and isolating them.
Yeah.
And that's the complexity of having to negotiate long-term relationships, because that they are, if for an individual to flourish, it's impossible for them to be autonomously self-directing. They have to honour other people, and that's increasingly seen as a patriarchal or
that's right.
monstrous imposition, when in fact we used to call it love.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so there's a disenchantment that then further removes meaning and the sense of being part of something good. So we also, Aristotle was right. We are social beings. We inherit language, we didn't choose it. We inherit parents, we didn't choose it. We inherit a political system. And this idea that you choose these things is the origin of the madness. It's just a mistake about the power of the individual to define their life.
Absolutely.
And then that limits the possibility of change.
Yeah.
Because you can't get together with others.
Yeah.
And anyway, you shouldn't. Democracy shouldn't be. Democracy is inherently involves insiders, so therefore it's inherently lots of bad things.
Yeah. And then you reach the ridiculous situation where people think they can choose their own sex and decide what gets put on their birth certificate. And it goes down this rabbit hole of, pretend.
It's the same logic.
It's the same logic
of choice, when it's a fundamental mistake to think that you can choose everything about yourself.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. Subscribe now so that you never miss an episode. And it would be great if you could give us a rating and maybe even a review. That is a really good way to help new listeners discover the show. I wanted to ask you about globalism. You've made a very interesting point before about the difference between globalism and internationalism, which I actually think is an important point to make and an important point to reiterate, because one of the frustrating things I find is that, because I'm Eurosceptic and I'm concerned about the erasure of borders and I'm interested in people's attempt to restore the national sovereignty
and democracy,
people will assume you're anti-internationalist, you're a little Englander, you want to hide away from the world. But in my mind, globalism and internationalism are very, very different things. And how would you describe the difference between them?
Well, they're opposed things. They are completely opposed things. So globalization is based on the unimpeded movement of capital, goods, services and people through space. It is illegal to resist that movement. So globalization is the ultimate ideology where it makes it illegal to resist capitalism. That is, I think, deep down what the Lisbon Treaty is about, that workers can't organise for themselves because that would discriminate against other workers. It's impossible, and that's embedded in the theory, says that we'll all be better off in that way. Whereas internationalism is, in all cases, a solidarity with others who are oppressed and exploited, within a capitalist nation-state economy or within a globalized economy. So it's very vital for people like me. So, for example, 2 weeks ago, I went to show my solidarity with the Kurds in eastern Syria who fought ISIS. You know, if you want to know a fascist, violent, rapist, it's extraordinary. And with women's equality, but they're not European, right? So that's a very important expression of internationalism. 2 weeks' time, I'm going to Iraq on the pilgrimage of the Arbaeen with the Shia, because they're also trying to resist the corruption, the pollution of their waters. So internationalism is an active cultivation of a relationship of solidarity with people who are resisting exploitation and oppression. Right. And globalization is a system which makes it illegal to resist those things. Right. I just think it's quite important that we rediscover that distinction. Yeah.
I think you've nailed it there. So you talk about the Lisbon Treaty. I think that description of the Lisbon Treaty as effectively making worker solidarity impossible on the ridiculous basis that it would discriminate against other foreign, possibly migrating workers. In relation to the EU more broadly, to me and you and to many, many other people, it's obvious what's wrong with the European Union. You know, it's you have described it, and I think this is an echo of Tony Benn, as an entirely capitalistic institution from head to toe.
The greatest capitalist project ever devised by the human mind, because it's perfect. It's at all levels.
It really is. So the question I had to you, because this does mystify me, and I've had the debate with them millions of times, but why do leftists and progressives not see that? Or do they see it and they don't care? Have they kidded themselves? What's happening with that?
Okay, so it goes back to the previous question. So I think it's necessary, if I do try to live some form of humility in life, to understand, and I've really tried to engage with it. So the first is a real hatred of nationalism, which we can completely understand, that the EU genuinely represents an international order that stops war. Now, setting aside that this doesn't quite extend in Europe to Russia, you know, which is a kind of important point, that the EU is still fundamentally embedded in NATO. And by the way, I think a very important part of the Brexit agenda that we should pursue is a reconciliation with Russia, and at least recognise their losses in the Second World War, which we've never done as a country. So I would like the Queen to go to Moscow, because she lived through the war as her last act, sort of, and say to the Russian people, thank you. I think it's long overdue. But set that aside, if we're trying to understand left progressive Europhilia, the first is a hostility to nationalism, and we have to engage with that. And then the EU is a peace project, you know, that we should recognise that it may be extremely unpleasant to witness the negotiations between EU nation states, but it's certainly better than war, and particularly France, Germany having some way of sharing power is a tremendous advance. And don't forget Jacques Delors coming in the 80s to the Trade Union Congress and talking about social Europe and social protections and all manner of things that were threatened by Thatcherism, so that there was a notion that that Europe was more progressive and more socially progressive than we were. And then you look at the origins of the EU, and they're quite inspiring in some ways. German, French, iron, coal, cooperation across borders. I think it was kind of, I mean, I'm from a long Labour history of Euroscepticism, but I can understand, and I could really understand holding that position up till the 80s. And then what you have, particularly in the early 90s with Maastricht and then with Lisbon, is weirdly the conquest through treaty law. So this is the thing, you can't change it through an election. This you can't reform. In fact, became colonized by Thatcherism. And so they stopped doing the Catholic stuff, the subsidiarity, the local priority, and they went for a globalized model. So I can understand people who voted for the EU in 75, as I can understand the rationality of that. It just no longer applied now. So what you have is the disintegration of the political economy of the left, which means that they don't have a critique of capitalism. So, I mean, you could argue till you're blue in the face, but it just remains true that a third of Labour's manifesto would be illegal under EU law.
Absolutely.
I like the idea that it could be is just ludicrous. And so then it becomes a anti-racist peace project. So this is the crucial thing. Whenever I talk to Tories about the EU, I always end the conversation with saying, and thank you for doing the work of socialism, because without sovereignty, we couldn't deliver our political economy. And they look at me askance, but I always have the good manners to do that. So what you have weirdly is conservatives doing the work of socialism, and you have socialists actually doing the work of capitalism. Right. And that's one of the peculiar features of our time.
That's a really fascinating way to put it. My last question, I've got a million more questions, but I'm just going to keep it to one. Where now for the Labour Party? Because surely there'll be a split. Surely it will go off in different directions. Is it salvageable at all? Or do you think, having gone through the pains of New Labour and its nanny-statism and its globalism and its market obsession through to the problems of Corbynism, having now become a Remain party, which in my eyes dooms it in the eyes of many working class people, is it a salvageable project, or do we need something new?
Well, I think I began the interview by talking about a strange work, faithfulness. The Labour tradition is a very rich tradition which has enriched my life enormously, transformed myself. So I take inspiration from that. I also take comfort in a lifetime of political defeat. I don't think I've ever really been on the winning side. So in many ways, this is normal, and the hysteria and the noise around it. But there is a country, and there is a country where people live, and there is a country where people want democracy, and they want a transformed economy, and they want some social security and stability in their lives. And my hunch is that something close to Blue Labour is the majority view in the country. Now, politics is like that. If Labour continues to go along the way that it's going, then it will lose an election, and the Conservatives will win. And what happens when you lose once or twice and then 3 times is that there's some notion that maybe you should try and reconnect to the people who built the party and the values of the people who, in fact, do matter. So everything that I do in politics is about looking to that point when Labour engages in a conversation about its own renewal and the realities of the democratic politics. And it's just the most important thing for me is just that this position is there in the conversation when that happens, and opens up space for deepening democracy, for forms of economic democracy, of restoring vocation, of establishing regional banks. This is the things that will bring some meaning and some fulfillment to people in their lives. So Labour's been here before. It's not new. I urge people to take that view. It's been a very, very important institution in the history of our country, and I'm faithful to it.
Maurice Glasman, thank you very much. Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.